All right, so good morning and welcome. It's great to have you all here, and yeah, wow. Can you just feel how things shift when we're singing, especially with that last song? How as we start to proclaim, we'll proclaim God's word, then something in you rises and say, we're going to speak to sickness, we're going to speak to lies, and we're going to see them change. And that's also in a big way what this morning's offering is about. I've called it Partakers of Grace because that is what we become as we contribute to the work of the Lord. So Paul is speaking in Philippians 4, and in verse 10 he says, I was made very happy in the Lord now that you have revived your interest in my welfare after so long a time. You were indeed thinking of me, but you had no opportunity to show it. Now I put this verse in here to frame the context of what we're going to get to. Paul is speaking to the Philippians, he's writing to them. There's been a long time in which he has not experienced them thinking about him, has not experienced their interest in him. So he's convinced that they were interested in him, but he didn't have there was no physical evidence for it, in a certain sense. So it's after a long while. And now I'm skipping over a couple of verses to verse 15, but then he says, you Philippians yourselves, you well know that in the early days of the gospel ministry, when I left Macedonia, no church or assembly entered into partnership with me, except and opened up a debit and credit account in giving and receiving, except you only. So he's reminding them that their contributions that they've made, and now this was a long time ago. So a long time ago they contributed to the ministry, they've now revived it, but he reminds them that he remembers that a long time ago they entered into partnership. Now that's the thing. So they brought physical resources to the table, and they donated to Paul so that he can minister the gospel, and that is a partnership that we enter into. Now, in a partnership, you know well that it works. It's a pooling of resources. All right, so whatever resources different partners bring to the table, the partnership is formed because not all parties have all parts. So there's talents on the one side and there's talents and resources on the other side, and these need to come together to build a synergy. And that's what Paul's talking about here. So Paul had the calling and he had the ability to go and to endure all the hardships, like being shipwrecked and all of that. So he had the grace on his life to go do that and to be traveling and ministering the gospel to the Gentiles, whereas the Philippians had physical means. So the Philippians have means, they want the gospel to spread, but they don't have the grace on their lives to go and live the calling. Whereas Paul, on the other hand, he's got that calling from God, and so they pool the resources. It's a partnership. And I want to show you where that goes from here. For even in Thessalonica, you sent me contributions for my needs, not only once, but a second time. And so that is what he ends the letter with. Now, that's the context, that's the mindset in which he's writing this letter to the Philippians. Now, when we pick it up in the first chapter of Philippians, there in verse 5, then as he addresses them, he says, I thank my God for your fellowship and your sympathetic cooperation and your contributions and your partnership in advancing the good news, the gospel, from the first day you heard it until now. So all of those contributions, from the beginning all the way through up to and including now, it's from the first day you heard it until now. But he's thanking God continually for the fellowship. And now that word fellowship there, if you go to the original Greek, is the word koinonia. And so that has got a couple of meanings. So fellowship is one meaning there, but you can also see it as communion. It's often translated as communion. In other words, there's an intertwined interest in fellowship. It's a shared load. You are partaking in what is actually happening, and also of the fruits of it. Participation is a word that it can be translated with. Sharing is a word that it can be translated with. So we could say, I thank my God for your sharing from the first day until now. Or I thank my God for your participation from the first day until now. Or I thank God for your communion from the first day until now. All of those words could be interchanged there in the context here. So it's a cooperation and a contribution, and specifically then a benefaction even. So what Paul is saying is, you are preaching the gospel because I am preaching the gospel and you're contributing to it. That's what he's saying. It's a partnership. He goes on in verse 6 to say that I'm convinced and sure of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will continue that good work until the day of Jesus Christ, right up to the time of his return, developing that good work and also perfecting and bringing it to full completion. So he's linking a work that started when they started contributing to the spreading of the good news to their participation, to their partnership. And then saying that this good work is a work that keeps on growing. It's a good work that keeps on being perfected and that keeps on being brought to a full completion, which means that it's ever increasing, which means that it's a good investment. All right. And so then he goes further and he says, it's right and appropriate for me to have this confidence and feel this way about you because you have me in your heart. And then he says, and I hold you in my heart as partakers and as sharers, one and all with me of grace, of God's unmerited favor and spiritual blessing. So he's indicating here that the contribution from the Philippians side makes them enter into a partnership of which they become then partakers and sharers, shareholders with all the dividends and all the fruit that comes from that. So, but there's a grace on Paul's life, and the grace on Paul's life was to go and to minister the gospel to the Gentiles. So what do they become partakers of? They became partakers of ministering that same gospel to those same Gentiles and the spreading of the good news. So ultimately, when the rewards come, they don't belong only to Paul, but they belong to all of the Philippians that contributed. So you become a partaker and a shareholder. It works a little something like that, because Paul goes on and he says, it's true both when I'm shut up in prison. In other words, when I'm in prison, you're in prison. If I'm being locked up for the gospel, you are being locked up for the gospel. If I'm being persecuted for the gospel, then you are being persecuted for the gospel. And when I am out in defense and confirmation of the good news, then that's true also. So when I am out there in confirmation and defense of the good news, then you are out there in defense of in confirmation of the good news. So because we are in a partnership. If you partner with the ministry, then you become a partaker of the grace on that ministry. Now, if it's this ministry, then it's living in victory. All right.
Yes.
And so that's what we have. It's a pooling of resources. I get to taste your ice cream, and you get to taste my ice cream. All right. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to give you an opportunity to give. Bless you as you do so. And may you really, really be encouraged by knowing that whatever you have contributed to in the past, the Lord is bringing that work, it's being perfected, and it's being brought to full completion.